Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our online Bible study. My name is Matthew. I'm the lead and teaching pastor here at Mansfield Pentecostal Church, where every Tuesday night we have a thought to think about, a question to ponder, and a text to study. We're continuing our Bible study series titled The New Creation Story, where we're looking at each of the books of the New Testament. We looked at the Gospels, we looked at Acts, Paul's 13 letters, Peter's letters, John's letters. And you recall that last week we started to look at the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, with the theme being the Lamb wins. And you remember that the book of Revelation brings to a completion the story of the whole of the Bible. I looked at last week particularly the parallel between the first part of Genesis and the last part of Revelation. In Genesis, we see the entrance of death and sin and the curse and the fall and all the problems that we see in the world today. But when we come to the book of Revelation, we see the end of death, that sin is dealt with, the curse is removed. There's a new Jerusalem, there's eternal life. We are no longer are we banished from the presence of God as we saw in Genesis, but now actually we have a place in the very presence of God, and will dwell with him forever and ever. And so Revelation brings to a conclusion the problem that we saw in Genesis. And as I mentioned last week, both the books of Genesis and Revelation are the two most attacked books, because if you can persuade us otherwise, or someone otherwise, about where they've come from and where they are going, it profoundly impacts upon their identity as a person. And so Revelation is an important book for us to grasp as followers of Christ, to make sense of all that is going on in the world around us. Now, you recall that when we're looking at the book of Revelation, it was written by John, who was the only apostle of Jesus who did not die by unnatural deaths. So all the other apostles, as far as we know, were martyred for their faith, died some horrendous deaths, but John died a natural death. And he was on the island of Patmos, just off the coast of modern-day Turkey, when he received a series of revelations of visions from the Lord regarding events leading up, about Jesus, primarily about Jesus, but also events leading up to his return. And so the book of Revelation is what we call an apocalypse, which means it is an unveiling of Christ and the events leading up to his return. And really the book of Revelation is given to the church to encourage us to persevere in the faith, even when we see all sorts of negative things going on in the world around us. And so when you come to a book of Revelation, you'll know that it's filled with symbolism. There's a lot of symbols and numbers and various items in Revelation that can scare off even the most hardened believer. And because of that, as I mentioned last week, there have been mainly four schools of thought that seek to understand a book like Revelation. Some people understand that Revelation is be seen as a book that's purely a description of the spiritual battle between God and Satan, between the kingdom of light and the kingdom of darkness, and it does not relate to events here on earth. And that is called the idealist school of thought, or the spiritual school of thought. And therefore, it's just purely to be seen as a spiritual allegory. It's seen to be nothing more than that, and there's some spiritual lessons for us to learn today. On the other hand, some people see the book of Revelation as that which relates to the relationship between the church and the state of Rome within the first century. And certainly when you look at the book of Revelation, you can see those parallels. And this is called the preterist view. Again, others see the book of Revelation as a recount of the events of history from Christ's resurrection to his coming in the future. And so there's like a chronological story of the events of history leading up to the time of Christ. That is called the historicist view. And again, on the other hand, some people see the book of Revelation as purely referring to events in the future, particularly in the last 7 years of history prior to Christ's return, and this is called the futurist view. Now, it's my view that actually all four schools of thought play a role in understanding a book like Revelation. However, I would say the predominant view in understanding Revelation is what I would call the futurist view, i.e. is speaking of events into the future, particularly prior to the return of Christ, the last 7 years prior to the return of Christ. However, it's very apparent that there are elements of an idealist view. Yes, there are spiritual lessons in Revelation and ethical lessons to learn that we can grow in. There are definitely historicist elements in the book of Revelation, where we see events in history and we see the fulfillment in the words of Revelation. And again, there are also, I would say, preterist elements in Revelation, in the sense that when you look at Revelation and you understand the relationship between the church and the state of Rome, like, for example, the Babylon being sitting on the hill, the city of the seven hills, which is obviously a reference to Rome, you can see very clearly there are elements of that in the book of Revelation as well. But I think the predominant view and understanding Revelation is the futurist view. Now, what I want to do is just give two examples in which we see these different views being played out from the book of Revelation that hopefully give us a bit of a grasp of how we read and understand this unique and incredible book. At the beginning of Revelation, we see that Jesus writes 7 letters to 7 churches in what we now know today as modern-day Turkey: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamon, Thyatira, Laodicea, etc. Okay? And very clearly, when you read these letters that Jesus addresses to these churches, you need to read them in the immediate context in which they were written. You need to understand the historical background of Ephesus and Pergamon and Thyatira and Laodicea to understand the context in which Jesus is writing these letters. And therefore, the historicist view would come into place to understanding these 7 letters. However, I would also say that, on the other hand, there is also an idealist understanding of those letters, because it wasn't just written. Jesus didn't just write those letters for those churches at that specific time. It's also very clear that he wrote these letters for the church today. And I believe that, Jesus could say the same thing to us as he said to the church of Ephesus. You've lost your first love. You've forgotten your first love. He could say the same thing to us as he did to the church of Laodicea. You become lukewarm. You're compromising. So there is also an idealist understanding of these 7 letters. But the primary backdrop to those letters is the historicist view. Again, there's another example where, we see an interplay of these views and understanding a book like Revelation. In Revelation chapter 8, we have this interesting account where John says this: "A great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky, and a third of the rivers and on the springs of water, and the name of the star is called Wormwood. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter." And so it's interesting that there's a star called Wormwood, and a third of the rivers and a third of the waters all across the world become bitter. And 26th of April 1986, this world experienced the worst nuclear accident in history. The nuclear reactor at Chernobyl, I think it was reactor 4, was undergoing a test, and due to mismanagement and poor design features, the reactor went out of control, it overreacted, and it exploded, creating a radioactive cloud that scattered across Russia, parts of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, spread all across Europe, and caused all sorts of damage. 2 people immediately got killed during the accident. First responders died soon after the accident due to radiation sickness. Years later, people are having problems with their thyroid and thyroid cancer. And it's been known that there have been ongoing impact effects due to that nuclear accident. As you can imagine, the radioactive source got into the water supplies, it got into the food chain, and it created all sorts of environmental damage as a result of that. However, what you may not be aware of is that in the Russian language, Chernobyl means wormwood, which, as you may have noticed, is the description in the book of Revelation that is given to the star that fills the earth and makes the waters of the earth bitter. And so you see there is a correspondence between an event in history and the vision that John has, which would suggest there is both an historicist and an idealist understanding of that text. The historicist view shows that there was an event in history, 26th of April 1986, in which wormwood, Chernobyl, exploded, creating all sorts of environmental catastrophe on the earth. But you also see there's a spiritual reality behind that event when John describes a star falling from heaven. So behind the earthly natural events, there are spiritual realities that we need to be aware of. However, if you was living before 1986, for you, the event of Chernobyl and Wynwood was in the future. And so it would have a futurist view and understanding. So the reason why I'm saying this is that each of these four views all play out one way or another when it comes to understanding the book of Revelation. And we've also got to keep in mind as well that there may be some events described in the book of Revelation that have already happened, and have already been fulfilled that we're not aware of, but which may come to light at some point in the future. So given the importance, I believe, of using all these four different views or schools of thought to understanding a book like Revelation, which is incredibly multi-layered, I'm going to just give you just a brief outline of the structure of the book, keeping in mind that next week we'll delve a little bit more into the content. I think the Revelation can be divided into four parts. The first part is relation to Jesus' words, revelation of Jesus himself and his words to the church. We see this again in chapter 2, where chapter 1, where the Lord says, on the Lord's day, John says that I was in the Spirit, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet, which said, write on the scroll what you see and send it to the seven churches, to Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamon, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. And so we see the first part of the Revelation starts off with the Lord's words and instructions to these seven churches. I also want you to notice something, that in each of these divisions or sections of the book of Revelation, there's a phrase like, come and see, and I was in the Spirit. So John was in the Spirit, and he has an invitation to come and see the events are about to happen on the earth as a result of this revelation that John receives. And so the first part relates to Jesus and the letters that he brings to these seven churches. The second part relates really to the events that are going to transpire or are transpiring upon the earth, leading up until the point of Christ's parousia or his appearing. We see this again in chapter 4, where it reads, after this, I looked, and there before me was a door standing open in heaven, and the voice I'd first heard speaking to me like a trumpet said, come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this. So come and see. And then it goes on to say, and then John goes on to say, I was in the Spirit, and there before me was the throne in heaven and someone sitting on it, which demonstrates that ultimately God is in control of the events that are unfolding in history. And so we have seven seals, seven trumpets, seven bowls, and we have the unfolding of events on history where God is in control, God is in charge, and stuff is happening on the earth due to spiritual realities, and that there are problems on earth, but ultimately we see that the Lord is in control. We particularly see in this section here a false Messiah, an alternative Messiah, or an antichrist, who is the beast, who is empowered by Satan, who gains political control over the world and wages war against God's people. We also see a false prophet, who is like the mouthpiece of the false Messiah as well. And so we see events happening on earth, but ultimately God is in control. The third section of the book of Revelation regards God's judgment against the godless world system of Babylon, and against the beast and the false prophet, and against the dragon. And it starts with this, and it says that one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came to me and said, notice this, come and I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits on many waters. We have heard the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of adulteries. And then the angel carried me away in the spirit into a desert. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had seven heads and 10 horns. And so we see the judgment of Christ against Babylon, the godless world system that we see around us, against the kings of the earth who rebel against God, against the beast, against the false prophet, and against Satan, who is thrown into the lake of fire, and also the great white throne of God's judgment on earth. And so that's the third vision that we see. And then as we come right to the end of the book of Revelation, the last section is John's vision of the new world and the new heaven and the new earth. And in this section, we see that one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls full of the seven last plagues came and said to me, "Come, and I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb." And he carried me away again in the spirit to a mountain great and high. And he showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of the heaven of God. And we see this wonderful vision of the new heaven and the new earth that God is going to create for us to dwell in. And so as we look at the book of Revelation, we see, again, there's this interplay between events that are happening on earth and events that are happening in heaven. And again, we see that what happens in heaven impacts on what happens on earth. And so you've got to look at the book of Revelation with those eyes. We see examples of angels, the redeemed, of different people who are interplaying in the story of God here on earth. And so I think Revelation is a book that helps us to see behind the veil of the events that are going on in this world. You also know that in the book of Revelation, numbers play a particularly important role. For example, the number 7 occurs 55 times, and we get multiples of 7, like 3.5 years, which is half the 7, and 42 months. We also get the number 12 comes up quite often, and multiples of 12, like 144,000. The number 10 comes up quite often, and multiples of 10, like 1,000 years, or tens of thousands. Sometimes there's been a debate among scholars whether this refers to literal names or numbers of people or periods of time, or is meant to represent something more symbolic. But again, that is an issue of debate. And so when you look at this incredible book of Revelation, you also notice that, like other apocalyptic literature, particularly in the Hebrew Bible, there's some similarities. So when you read Revelation, you also need to read the book of Daniel alongside it, as well as the book of Zechariah and Ezekiel. And I believe that these books give us a little bit more of an insight as to understanding the nature of the book of Revelation. But ultimately, all the book of Revelation is leading us up to the parousia, the appearance of Christ when he comes a second time. And that is the object of our hope and perseverance. And though John doesn't describe in great detail the exact nature of Jesus' coming, although he comes in the clouds of heaven, certainly, John is certainly giving us an understanding of the events of the world that are transpiring leading up to his soon return. And so Revelation is given to encourage us in our faith, to persevere, not to give up. As you saw at the very beginning of Revelation, Jesus' letters to the 7 churches, they were written to real believers with real needs. And so the Lord's letter of Revelation is written to us in our point of need. And so it helps us to see the spiritual battles behind the earthly realities. It helps us to see the unfolding of God's purposes in history, but also to place our hope, our future hope in Christ, in his coming and when he returns in his glory. And so, guys, I want to encourage us to read and reread and reread the book of Revelation with prayerful consideration. I don't find it coincidental that the communist state of China rejects the book of Revelation in its sponsored state church, and it does not want the church teaching on Revelation. And we know why, because it's scared of the book of Revelation, because Revelation speaks of the kingdoms of this world becoming the kingdom of our God. And so I want to encourage us all, let's read Revelation with prayerful consideration and ask the Lord how he wants us to live out this book in the light of events that are happening on earth. Next week, again, we'll just finish off in Revelation and we'll delve a little bit more into the content of the book. However, a question to ponder, I'd like you to discuss this question within your life groups. How should knowing that the Lamb wins shape the way you will respond to pressure, uncertainty, compromise, and suffering today? So how should knowing that the Lamb wins shape the way we will respond to pressure, uncertainty, compromise, and suffering today? And that's the question to ponder. A text to study is in Revelation chapters 1, verses 9 to 20, What does John tell us about his situation, location, and spiritual experience in verses 9 to 11? What details are used to describe that the risen Jesus in verses 12 to 16? And what do they reveal about his glory, authority, and holiness? Why do you think Jesus reveals himself to John before giving messages to the 7 churches? Where do you need a fresh vision of Jesus' authority, presence, and victory in your own life or in the life of the church? Guys, if you feel that you've got something out of this tonight, why not give it a thumbs up? Why not share it? Hey, listen, if you feel you're getting something out of this channel, why not subscribe to it and continue to receive more teaching? Hey, God bless you all, and I'm looking forward to seeing you over the weekend.